the makers, the hackers, and the innovators, building the future of digital health. It's time to start the Digital Health Workbench podcast, hosted by Jeff McCleary. And welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Jeff McCleary, and this is the Digital Health Workbench podcast. We're really excited to have folks here today. This is the podcast for digital health makers, breakers, and game changers, the people that architect, build, and occasionally break, and are ultimately creating the future of digital health. Each month, we will chat or endeavor to chat with a different industry leader. We'll talk about their digital health journey. What are they building now? What are the tools on their workbench? And what will they use today and tomorrow? So with that in mind, please help me welcome our guest today. He is the CEO of AmalgamRx, a pioneer in the digital health industry, Ryan Sysko.
Hey, Jeff.
Ryan, thanks for joining.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We'll get into what you're doing currently in a bit, but it's funny, as I was doing your bio and I looked through and mentioned the word pioneer. You may not have hitched up the Conestoga wagon and headed out west, right? But when I look back at that time period, like the late aughts and the early 2000 teens or tens or whatever they're called, it was a bit of the wild, wild west, especially when it comes to digital health or back then mHealth. And so, I was wondering if you could maybe share a little bit about how you got into that space and,
Sure.
and what gave you where'd you start? What gave you the fortitude to say, I think we have a different thought here, right? Because everybody had an app. There were so many apps out there that I think there were more than one digital pharmacies being built. I think Haptique was a big one.
Yeah.
Shout out to Ben Choder and that crew. But there were all of that, and it was almost a world where you built an app and you could get promoted in certain places. And you guys came along with the idea that, hey, we could actually think of these things as a drug and look at them validating through clinical trial and potentially even reimbursement. How did you get there?
Yeah, it's a great story. I'd say it's more naivete than fortitude. And I always say we were definitely trailblazers. I can show you the scars on my back to prove it. The journey started for us in 2005. My background, I was in financial services. My sister, Suzanne Clough, is an endocrinologist, and she was commiserating about the state of diabetes with her colleagues in 2005, and really around how they just didn't have enough time to see patients. They may have seen them for 2 to 4 hours a year. The rest of the time they're on their own, expected to manage this very complex chronic condition. And they just felt like patients didn't have the resources. They couldn't extend their clinical voice enough to give them the right support. So lo and behold, kind of the cell phone in 2005, every patient started walking in with one. Now, mind you, this is pre-iPhone. Right. But the idea was, could we create an application to help support a patient? So how to take their meds, how to support their wellness, so what to eat, exercise, really taking all of the clinical best practices and putting it into something that was at a patient's fingertips. And, she got me involved because I was in the technology space. I'm not a technologist, but I know how to sell it. So we actually cobbled together some money, built a first prototype. We found a Java developer in Baltimore, Maryland, and we built an application that worked on a Nokia phone. And one of my sister's patients, Stuart Greenbaum, was a VIP patient at the University of Maryland. And he had access. You talk about somebody who had access to every resource in healthcare and on-call support whenever he needed it, but he still could never get his A1C down to a level that was in target. And so Suzanne went to Stuart and said, hey, I have this new app. I'd love you to try it. He tried it, and within 60 days, his A1C was in target for the first time ever. And he actually said, if this will work for me, it will work for anybody. And he wrote us a check for $1 million. And that was the start of WellDoc. And I think in the early days, we had a lot of conversations with health systems. We started to talk to some payers. Now, mind you, most people said, "God, my patients only use their phone to talk, right? They don't use it for anything else." But what we sort of bumped into was this resistance of saying, "Well, geez, I need to know that this is going to work before I'll pay for it or use it." There really is this need for evidence in healthcare, and so as we sat around the table and said, well, why do drugs or why do devices get paid for? And they said, well, they do clinical trials, they go through a regulatory process, doctors prescribe them and health plans reimburse them. And he said, well, that's what we want to do. And I think kind of in 2005, we sort of gave birth to the digital therapy industry, really that simply saying we want to take a pathway that's similar to drugs and devices because we believe if we do, these things will get paid for.
Yeah. And you were the first, WellDoc was the first licensed product by the FDA that could actually had a CPT code and could get reimbursement, right? How did the reimbursement journey start? Like, was that
so
tough to get?
it was very complex. I would say there's the FDA piece, and this was before the FDA really had, there had been software and there were rules around software as a medical device, right? Because you think about firmware that's used in medical devices, but the kind of true sort of SAMD landscape that we know didn't exist. And it actually took us from start to finish about 3 years to get our regulatory clearance from CDRH. I mean, when we first submitted it, they really had no idea what to do with it. Was it a device? What should they do? And so we spent a lot of time really figuring out that process. And again, we were incredibly naive around what it meant to be a medical device manufacturer. All of the processes and the quality systems that you need to have in place. So part of that journey was getting the company up to speed on how to become a medical device manufacturer. So that journey was a great journey. I still remember, I tell the story because we spent literally years trying to get our FDA clearance. And I remember my wife and I I was going to a conference in San Diego, and I had like the 6 a.m. flight out of Philly to San Diego. And I just remembered looking at my BlackBerry at the time and seeing that there was an eFax. And I assumed it was spam. I didn't look at 5 in the morning when I was up. But when I got on the plane, we got up in the air about an hour into the flight. I'm looking at my email and I say, oh, there was a fax that I got. I open it up and it was a letter from the FDA saying we were cleared as a medical device. Literally, I call the stewardess over. We get wine. Like this was just like in the early days of Wi-Fi on planes. I email that to the team at WellDoc. All of a sudden, I'm getting pictures back of people dancing on tables in India, in Delaware. It was like a party. And it was just such a great sort of defining moment that I'll always remember around our first FDA clearance.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. Funny to get a note on the plane. From there, you guys launched as an employer program.
Yeah, well,
right?
so
Primarily,
we thought a lot about sort of the reimbursement pathway, and I won't go into all the details, but there are essentially only 4 ways in healthcare where you can get paid, right? You can have an NDC code, which is drug, CPT code, procedures, HCPC for devices, and there's kind of like a UPC code, right, for kind of things over the counter. There's some other sort of administrative ways that payers can pay you, but as we looked at the landscape and said, how do we want to think about getting paid? The NDC code had some real advantages. One, it gets cleared, sort of transactions happen in real time. You can set your own pricing. You're not creating a pathway for your competitors, right, when you get your NDC code.
right.
And a lot of diabetes supplies, so blood testing strips, leverage the NDC code. So there was a lot of sort of familiarity within payers of paying, using that mechanism. So that's how we chose. And there was a lot of time and effort that we had to go through. One of the things, for example, we had to create a unit of measure for software. And we actually had to go in front of a national body at their national conference and sort of explain what a unit of measure for software was. And what we came up with was 1 each equals 30 days. So when you got a prescription for WellDoc, it was good for 30 days. And we figured most prescriptions are for 30 days. We'll just make our software unit of measure 30 days. Right. So that's how, we ended up, fitting into sort of the NDC pathway.
And was that a tough sell into employers once you had that, or was that a relatively,
I
I mean,
think
it's brand new,
employers
right?
were
But
employers were maybe the most receptive, right? As
okay.
you think about sort of, payers PBM are on the most sort of dubious side of the coin, saying, what is this new thing? Are we opening Pandora's box? Are we all of a sudden going to be paying for apps like drugs? Where I think employers and I think most people, who sell in this channel would say they're focused on other things, right? They're focused on employee engagement, retention, wellness. And so for them, if they can find a program that they think is going to add a lot of value for their employees, they're much more willing to pay. We sort of saw the employer channel as important because as big customers of the payers and PBMs, they can be a motivating factor in thinking about coverage for a product like WellDocs.
Right. And given kind of, well, a lot has changed and a little has changed from those days, right? Like looking back at it, is there, hindsight's always great, but is there a way you would approach it? You would have approached it differently, knowing what you know now?
I think so. I mean, look, there's some companies that have been really successful. Livongo is a great example, right? There you are seeing reimbursement. You are seeing PBMs that have set up their own digital form. So Evernorth, CVS, Caremark, right? These folks all have their digital, formularies, and so the world has sort of moved into this place. I think it just takes the one thing about healthcare: things take time. And so I think what I always say is you need to go and build sort of the coalition of the willing. Like if you're pushing that boulder up the hill, work with employer groups first. Look for, direct to consumer opportunities where you can gain traction, build evidence. I think there was a theory or thought that doing those types of things would undermine your pricing, your position with payers. But the reality is that I think once payers and PBMs see that there's adoption, and they see how things are working at scale or with their members, it only makes it easier for them, if things are successful, to go ahead and adopt your product.
Yeah. They want to see success at scale.
That's right.
Otherwise there's no reason to play. So coming out of, WellDoc, let's call that kind of version 1.0. And what sat between WellDoc and Amalgam? Was there, and how do we get into kind of the next version of your story with Amalgam?
Yeah. So in 2015, WellDoc raised its Series B. I had transitioned from CEO to chairman and was starting to think about what was next. And, the one thing I really felt strongly about is I didn't want to keep pushing that boulder up the hill of reimbursement. I had been sort of chasing that for kind of 10, 12 years. And I really believe that in 2015, that pharma would be pivoting to digital in a major way, and wanted to build more of a platform approach to say, how do we help enterprise customers do it better, faster, cheaper, really be sort of agnostic to a therapeutic area. But also secondarily, really solve sort of this challenge of scaling digital health. I think it's still really the Achilles heel for folks in the industry that, we haven't seen a lot of examples of large scale. And I almost say it's the inverse of the pharmaceutical industry. In the pharmaceutical industry, it's really hard and expensive and risky to create a drug. But once it's approved, everybody knows what to do, right? Adoption happens overnight.
There's a machine behind it.
There's a machine, right? In digital health, it's actually not that risky. We sort of know what to do. The technology isn't a challenge, right? So we can build these products, but once we build them, nobody knows how to use them, right? How do you integrate them into workflow? How do I make sure I remember as a provider that these things are available to me and my patients? So it's sort of an opposite challenge. Well, and really, go ahead.
Why is that, do you think, though? Is it because you kind of with WellDoc proved the model that you can look at it through the lens of a drug, right? Ergo, the machine should still work.
Yeah.
Like why did that not? Was it a fear? Was it a confusion? Was it disbelief? Like, why did that not translate well to that? Because we saw examples like some other companies in the space that tried to full on go at that same model, but just could not make success with it.
I think the reality is that it's digital health, or if you could, the DTX industry in specifically, is much more similar to the medical device space than it is the drug space. Right. So in the drug space, right, I write a script for a pill, the patient leaves, I'm done. I ask them, the patient comes back 90 days later, how did things go? Right. With medical devices, so if you think about sort of, the CGMs or insulin pumps, those companies like Medtronic, Dexcom, Abbott have set up entire workflows. I mean, Medtronic literally has people in doctors' offices when they order a pump to, get them set up, get them trained, like help the provider know how to get data back in. So with these, digital health applications, there's so much new clinical information that's happening. There's so much provider and patient behavior that's happening, that the system really isn't set up for what's possible, like how we could actually change the delivery of care with these tools. And I think that's part of what sort of didn't work, right? That was one of the major challenges.
And does that come, I mean, I think I know the answer from your position from Amalgam. Does that come better from outside partnerships? We've seen companies that set up their own separate digital studios or data houses that kind of manage that or attempt to be the software version of the drug asset company. What has been your experience in what's the optimal model, or what's the model that provides success for that?
Yeah, I think you've seen a bunch of different models. I mean, one model is, I would have never guessed that we would have so many companies sort of recreating the entire care experience, right? Creating like an Oshi, right? I'm going to create my own GI clinics and I'm just going to operate. Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to ignore the existing health system and just create my own. And so that's one model, and it's been successful for companies, right? That is an approach that is a viable approach. I think, on the opposite end of the spectrum, I think with some of the, the legislation that's happened, it's now a lot easier with data interoperability to integrate information into electronic health records. So you can work with providers, bring data information to their fingertips in their workflow, so you can fully integrate into kind of a health system environment. And then I think there's sort of the middle ground, which you're seeing kind of maybe more on the care coordination side, where, companies are supporting health systems, but doing it in their own care environment, but sharing data and information.
Yeah. So then maybe that's a good point to transition, kind of thinking through like the model that you guys chose with Amalgam, what led to picking that, and why that works for you guys.
Well, I sort of have a general bias that, of all the customers you can sell into in the healthcare system, pharma's probably the easiest, right? They have dollars to spend. They want to do things, right? Exactly. I mean,
you know how long those sales cycles are sometimes.
Yeah. So one, thinking about starting with pharma, but then, and as I mentioned, not only kind of helping them develop products, bring them to market, but then how we actually help them scale them. Because I think one of the lessons that we learned too, when you look at some of the major partnerships, whether it was like a Pear and Novartis, is that sort of the marriage of DTX or digital health companies with pharma, where there was just an expectation that pharma was going to take a solution, give it to their field force, and go scale it on their own, right? I think we've shown that doesn't work. There needs to be sort of new models, new collaboration. So how could we create a framework where not only could we build them, but could we build a distribution channel largely through the EHR? So could we build our own network of providers, integrate into EHR, so that once we built a solution, we could flip a switch and activate it for the providers who wanted it, and essentially own that distribution and create sort of what we call the iTunes model for the EHR.
Okay. So if the doctor decides, so instead of having the sales rep go in and promote this asset, whether it's a decision support tool or companion app or whatever, it then gets delivered through the option to be able to use it gets delivered through the EHR. So in that case, it's the physician's choice to use it. But how do you, there's an education barrier there, right? Like you got to make them aware of that. How do you handle that?
So I think that's where pharma can be leveraged, right? Because they can go and they can detail, they can educate, but instead of saying, hey, and we're going to set up this entirely new process in your office and teach your staff how to do something different, we say, here's what the program is. If you want it, it's available in your EHR, right? So how you streamline the implementation, so that real sort of implementation science of saying, how do we make it so simple that anyone can do it? And we can still leverage the sales and marketing brute strength that pharma and other life sciences companies have to drive demand, but we make it simple to implement and operate.
Right. Which eliminates some of, I think, what are the core challenges in like the payer relationship or some of those others where you can't retrain I won't say can't. It's difficult to retrain a pharma rep to be a software salesperson.
That's right.
And they aren't the first line of customer support necessarily when you have them in. So there's a model then to say, to triage the technical piece of that somewhere else and let the rep just essentially be your marketing channel, right?
That's right.
They're aware and that it's out there. Was it always the plan to be based on, like, if you look back to the original pitch for Amalgam, was it always the plan to be based through the EHR, or was there a different initial pathway that you guys had looked at?
I think the aspiration and vision was that it always would be. We didn't necessarily start there. So we built an insulin titration product, really as a reference product to show our capabilities. The idea wasn't to build a product where we generated reimbursement. We just wanted to show, because I think the theory that we had was that instead of building a digital therapy or a SAMD product that would generate its own standalone revenue and generate enough revenue that would be interesting to a pharma company to go and sell, we'd say, what if we could create a product that actually had an impact on an underlying pharma asset? And for me, sort of insulin titration was low hanging fruit. That, if you look at the US, the statistics, half the patients on insulin are under basalized. They use about half the basal insulin they should use.
Right.
We've had insulin titration algorithms published for decades, but providers feel they're too complicated, so they don't give them the patient. So technology could just provide a really simple tool. So the idea was provider orders the titration algorithm, patient gets an application, we manage their insulin dose. And again, the goal wasn't to go and say, get, Caremark or Evernorth or some payer to pay for it, but really to say, would Lilly, Sanofi, Novo Nordisk say, oh, this could be a great tool to support my patients on my product, and it may have some impact if we can get patients to some financial impact if we can get patients to the right dose.
Yeah.
And so that theory was like largely borne out, right? We built the product. We ended up partnering with Novo Nordisk. We tested the solution in Brazil. The first 1,000 patients who used the product doubled their insulin dose within 8 weeks. Their blood sugars came down by about 1 point in A1C. Wow. And now that product will be rolled out in 15 countries. It's cleared on 4 continents. It integrates with all of Novo's devices, their pens. It's integrating with kind of BGM, CGM. So I think it's a great example of sort of what's possible and how pharma can leverage digital health, SAMD solutions to drive their core business.
Yeah. And I noticed you've transitioned from the DTX to the SAMD. What is it? I think we've talked a little bit about that. Like, what are your thoughts on the state of the DTX market? Is it alive and kicking? Is it DOA or somewhere in between?
I'm an optimist, right? I'm an optimist. I feel like in a lot of ways, this is sort of my baby. I've spent 20 years pursuing this pathway. So I think it's alive and well. I think my gut feeling is that it will look much more like the medical device industry than the pharma industry.
Yeah.
And I think, if you can rationalize like pricing, expenses, go to market, sort of what that frame of reference, I think you can build really successful companies. I mean, I see companies like, Omada, talk about them going public, my understanding, WellDoc's doing very well. So there's, I think, some great companies operating in that space, but maybe not in the model, that, let's face it, kind of Pear and Achille tried. And I give them a lot of credit for the effort, but yeah. I just don't think you're going to be, we're not going to see the days of going and raising hundreds of millions of dollars for these products, building huge sales forces, spending a lot of money. It's going to be a much more sort of targeted approach. Build, test, learn, versus kind of the big bang approach that I think a lot of people try.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that I feel like I've noticed over the last couple of years is there was such a focus initially on hey, WellDoc did it, we can do that. Like
Yep.
let's build out that DTX. There's a revenue stream, and all sorts of companies would come in and tell you how many billions of dollars you can make as a pharma company by focusing on digital therapeutics. But I feel like maybe the regulations never quite caught up to enable the reimbursement that really helped that fulfill the promise. Almost like it kind of got choked off in the crib, right? If because there just wasn't the money there that was promised.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I mean, I think if you look at, like, for example, other countries like Germany with DIGA, France is developing a similar model. You are seeing success and companies get traction because there is an underlying reimbursement framework.
Yeah.
We haven't had that sort of on a truly national, fully rolled out scale. Again, I would say there are great examples of innovative payers who are paying for these solutions. There are PBMs who are paying employers, but we haven't seen, I know, the DTX Alliance has been pushing to see if they can get, any sort of federal regulations or CMS to adopt these technologies, but that hasn't happened. And let's face it, CMS is largely one of the big drivers of innovation, right? Once CMS starts to pay for something, private health plans start to follow. So, that framework hasn't really developed on a nationwide basis, as you said.
Yeah. And I feel like as part of that also, then a lot of that technology focus kind of shifted from the DTX space into earlier stage kind of efforts at pharma, like our R&D focus on biomarkers and being able to drive and support drug asset development, and then maybe pulling out of that. Can you kind of share a little bit on kind of maybe what your perspective is on that, and where you feel the current wave of focus and innovation on the drug asset development with digital technologies leads us to?
Yeah. I think if I think about the pharma value chain, to me, there's kind of four core areas that I think are worthy of investment, right? R&D, market access, med affairs, and commercial. On the R&D side, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think you're seeing a lot of companies kind of in the AI space looking at drug development. You're seeing a lot in the clinical trial space to sort of accelerate trials, to identify patients who are eligible for trials. So anything that you can do to increase speed to market, reduce risk for molecules, expand the pipeline. I think there's a major appetite within pharma for those types of solutions.
Yeah.
I think secondly, on the market access side, as you get into more sort of specialty products, buy and bill, products that are billed through the medical benefit, and you have sort of complicated benefits, verification, prior authorization, things that you can do to streamline those processes, get patients and providers the right information faster so that patients can start on product faster, I think is an area sort of worthy of investment. Medical affairs, there's a lot that we're doing in this space. You're seeing more and more pharma companies really interested in understanding how they can replace sort of the traditional medical science liaison who's going and having an unbranded, above sort of therapy conversation with the provider and doing more in the EHR. So I'm seeing a lot of companies trying to digitize guidelines so that providers are supported with next best actions. You've seen examples of BMS developing and partnering with AI companies in the cardiology space to identify patients who might be at risk for a certain condition. So anything sort of identifying patients, helping support provider decision-making, I think is another really exciting area. And then lastly, for me on the commercial side, again, things that tie into things that are more companion application oriented so that they have some direct benefit. So you have an amazing new class of drugs, the GLP-1s and obesity. Part of the challenge is patients only stay on therapy for 30 to 60 days. So whoever can crack that nut of saying, how do we help patients manage symptoms, side effects, have a good start experience, keep them on product for 12 months, that's where digital can play a major role and have an enormous impact on sort of the bottom line of a pharmaceutical company. So to me, sticking to kind of core pharma core inside the value chain, things that are going to drive their core revenue, because let's face it, their drugs generate billions of dollars of revenue. If you can have a 5% impact, right, that's a major impact on a business.
Yeah, it's a big bump. And I think Do you find that in the digital conversations, is there a light that clicks somewhere when you have some of these conversations like, oh, 5%, we might have gotten, maybe poo-pooed before, where now that all of a sudden starts to click and they equate the cost to return in a little more favorable light than maybe in past?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, there's always that hype cycle. So I think, some of these technologies were oversold, overhyped, overpromised. And so when you promise 50 to 100% and you don't deliver it, right, there's real disappointment. But if you under promise, over deliver stuff, I say get you 5 and I get you 7, right, then all of a sudden people are excited about it. So I think it's around setting the right expectations. Like we're now in this hype cycle around AI, and I think AI is going to have a major impact. I think you're going to see just a ton of continued investment in the next few years. But I do think there's some of that danger of, are we overselling it? How do we go in, set the right expectations? But yes, I think if you can build the right business case, you can build incredibly exciting business cases with having kind of a small impact.
Yeah. So obviously AI is the big elephant in every room and every conference that you go to the point that it's not the elephant anymore. You can't spell an event without putting AI in it somewhere. Where do you see the biggest value, or where are you guys focusing your efforts around AI or generative AI?
Yeah, so I think if I go back to, pharma and those 4 kind of use cases, I would say for us, we are launching our first Gen AI product in Q2 on the commercial side. So it'll be an application to help support caregivers who are supporting loved ones with Alzheimer's. We bought a Gen AI company about 3 years ago, had some really interesting algorithms. And it's kind of the differentiator for us in that space is we have about 130 guardrails that we think make it sort of medical grade or compliant within the pharmaceutical industry. So, our chat bot is empathetic. It only uses curated and approved information. It's not going to hallucinate. It can report AEs. It can sort of direct patients to the right sort of emergency resources based on what's sort of written in sort of the application. So that's going to be a really exciting product for us. We'll have kind of stay tuned, more news to come in the April-May timeline. So that's a big area of focus. Also then on the med affairs side, in the EHR, how we're using AI to support next best actions, moving away from sort of more traditional rules-based to more AI-based. Even on the payer side, we do, this is public knowledge, Aetna is a partner, CVS is an investor, how we can start to use AI to help support and align shared savings agreements between providers and payers. So looking at populations and understanding what's the best way to dramatically improve, let's say, HEDIS or STARS outcomes, right? What can we do? So those are some of the areas that we're investing in.
You mentioned Alzheimer's. Are there, I'm assuming maybe that's a partnership or collaboration with a company that may not be named, but when you look across the therapeutic areas, obviously you've done work in diabetes in the past and insulin delivery, Alzheimer's. What other areas do you think are really ripe for transformation through these technologies and these approaches?
Yeah, I think so. One, I think just looking at sort of like the types of patient applications or DTX products that people have historically built. I think there's, moving away from sort of traditional rules-based models where, we predetermine a set of pathways that a patient may go down to systems that begin to learn and understand and decide what might be sort of the next best action to drive the best outcomes, right? So that we can more quickly get to a highly tailored, personalized experience that's delivering the right information for a patient to get the best outcomes, right? That's sort of, in my mind, in the kind of digital application space or the DTX space, how AI, can be leveraged sort of right away.
Yeah. How have you found maybe pharma in particular adapting to that, right? Because when you talk about next best action, it can, we talk about med regulatory, legal, that'll send them sideways sometimes, right? So how have you found the evolution of skill sets and abilities to be able to internally manage the use of those technologies as well?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement, but there's also a lot of fear.
Yeah.
right? I think people are looking for, they don't want to be the guinea pig. And they also want to make sure that if you're doing something, let's say that's branded, right? How do you make sure that the AI isn't going to say things that are off label?
Right.
Right. And so I think there's a lot of risk. And so I think it will be sort of a crawl, walk, run. I think you'll see a lot of, and you already are seeing unbranded applications. So things that are sort of, agnostic to a therapy, but, it within a sort of chronic condition where they'll test the waters. We're seeing one a prospect that we're talking to, they're launching a chatbot, but it's going to be highly scripted. It's going to be, using soft keys to say yes, no, right? So it's no free text. And so that will be part of their strategy. And if that goes well and they like the results of our sort of, Gen AI launch, then they'll say, okay, now we can think about like what's version 2 of our chat. So I definitely think there'll be a crawl, walk, run strategy. And there will be a lot of well-founded sort of fear and paranoia around sort of how to use this in a way that sort of fits within the current regulatory environment.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of the regulatory environment, as we think about, like, if you had a wish list of changes that would enable, let's say, trusted and safe growth in the space,
Yeah.
like what would be your wish list from a regulatory standpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I would say, we now have clearances in Europe, US, soon to have Canada, Japan. We have Saudi, India, Brazil. And so there's a lot of overhead that comes with being a medical device manufacturer. Yeah. And there's positives and negatives. I mean, the positive side, it does create a competitive moat, right? As you think about you talked about everybody has an app. Well, not everybody has an app that could be regulatory cleared on 5 continents, right? So like the subset of competitors like keeps getting smaller and smaller. So in some ways, that's an advantage to us. It is a challenge from a business perspective. One, it does take a lot of time. It costs money. I liked the idea that the FDA had where they almost had like the TSA pre-check for regulated applications. They had their pilot program with about 10 companies and you could get certified and bring solutions to market. I thought that was really innovative. They had some challenges. It never scaled. I don't know that the jury's out yet, but I mean, that is sort of a pretty interesting concept to me, that once you are sort of certified as an organization, then you're just audited to make sure that you're following your processes versus having to have products cleared before you can market them.
Right.
You're starting to see some innovation that I've seen, some platform companies that are getting platforms cleared for indications kind of across the board, as long as they stay within a general framework. So the one thing I would say is that I do feel like, what I've seen in the regulator space from, when we started in 2008 to, 2024, there is a lot more innovation, a lot more openness, a lot more willingness to try to be supportive. I would say in general, the regulators aren't, trying to stifle innovation. They want to foster it, but they want to make sure that, good quality products are being brought to market. I think the one other thing that's sort of been interesting is this whole sort of concept around, figuring out what in your product is really sort of the risky element and how you might be able to draw a box around that. And then all of the other things that we do around capturing data, moving data, things that don't really need to be regulated, that regulators are starting to say like, yes, we're open to the sort of that risk stratification to say, let's only focus on the higher risk elements of your product versus lower risk, which make it easier for folks like us.
Yeah, and I think we see a lot of that too in the med tech space, right? Like especially in companies that are post multiple acquisitions and need to unify platforms, but that they need a more segmented architecture approach to be able to say, hey, listen, changing this button doesn't mean I should have to resubmit everything and go through that process again. It's good to see progress in that area for sure. When you think about what you guys are building and whether those changes in the regulations come to fruition or not, what's the goal for kind of Amalgam's role in the new digital health ecosystem of the world, right?
Yeah, I think that, what we'd like to really do is our mission is to enable better healthcare decisions. And for us, that really means 2 things. We know we need to support providers and we want to support their next best action. So giving them the right information at the right time to make the best choice. And the goal for us is to be installed in every single health system across the globe, right? We're starting with US. We now have a sales team. We hired a great, chief growth officer, Matt Coombs, who joined us from the Butterfly Network. So he's building his team to go out and give away our decision support. And we want as many providers supporting our technology, because the more providers, the more we're going to influence, patients and getting them the right care and treatment. And for us, the other side of the coin is, if you want to actually get great outcomes, you can't just support providers. You have to also support patients. You need to extend providers' clinical voice so patients have the right support, they have the right resources to effectively self-manage their conditions. And so that's where, as you think about our platform, kind of the two core elements are the EHR, integrated decision support, and the underlying patient engagement platform that can be regulated.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, looking at your transition to WellDoc, building value and growth there, starting it with Amalgam and trying to do it again, I like to ask people, as I'm a maker at heart, like, what sits on the workbench for you? Like, what are the tools of the trade in building value in this space, in the digital health space? And from your perspective, whether it's people, process, technology, approaches, acquisition, whatever, like, what makes the difference for you? What are the things you have to be able to be successful in this space?
Yeah, so as I think about, at least the way that I've thought about sort of, starting companies, and I didn't really expect to start Amalgam, right? It's funny, when I left WellDoc, I said, I'm never going to do another startup. And here I am, kind of 7 years later. And I'm really thrilled that I did. But for me, it always starts with, like, what's the interesting problem that I'm trying to solve? Right. So, like, I always feel at the end of the day, if you're going to deliver value, you need to solve real challenges. And kind of building a mission and vision around that's something that is, attractive and recognizable to people. So you need to attract talent to help you solve these problems. And in order to do that, you need to, have the right mission vision, and then also build the right culture. So it's hard to get people. People have, talented people have a lot of options. And so in order to build the right team, which I think you fundamentally need to have, you need to have a compelling problem to solve, and you need to have a great environment to work in. And then I think for me, then the technology piece comes in. You need to also execute. I see so many companies, right, that have sort of great vision, great culture, but they can't actually get it done. And at the end of the day, I feel like that's one of the things that we do really well. We get dropped into an environment, we've been dropped in, now that we're a B2B company, into incredibly chaotic environments where they had, failure, and our job is to go in and just execute. And I think that's what we, really rely on as a team, to say, how do we make sure that wherever we go, we can add value by actually, making sure that we can get solutions to market, we can get them scaled, they'll work the right way. So those are kind of some of the things that I think about.
Yeah, no, that's great. And even on the customer side, when you talk about being able to go in and execute for a client or a customer, like especially on the pharma side, like what makes it successful? What has to be on their workbench to make it successful, to be able for you guys to come in and do those types of things?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I'd say, more often than not in my 20-year history in this space, the thing that causes most programs to fail is that they're just too hard, right? Somebody at the pharma company eventually gets sort of tired of pushing that boulder up the hill. And so I think there's, the reality is this is a new frontier for pharma. I think more and more, pharma companies are investing in, they're bringing in people who understand the space. When we first started, right, this was, just totally, orthogonal to what they do. They just had no idea how to sort of, take and adopt. And so things like processes, right, they were trying to apply their drug, processes to these types of solutions. And there's this mindset that, okay, we're going to spend a lot of money, built it, and it's done. We walk away. No, like, this is technology, right? You need to iterate, you need to evolve. So I think, there's a lot more sort of education and knowledge around launching and building these products. Is very similar to building a drug. You need to do the research the right way. You need to build a plan, execute on that plan, get it to market, evaluate, iterate. And so I think that's one of the things that we try to really set that expectation up front, to say, here's how, we build a way of working where we can both be successful. What do we need from you? What should you expect from us? And I think, we now have seen this across enough pharma companies that we can walk in and we have credibility to say, like, here's what it takes to build a successful program. And here's what it takes to build a successful partnership. And so we're just very upfront and honest and transparent about that in the beginning to say, here's what we all need to do to achieve success.
Yeah, that's great. And then, I like to ask around the question of, well, so you've been in this 20 years. Hopefully maybe before the end of the next 20 years, you're sitting on a beach sipping Mai Tais somewhere, looking at the current state. Like, what does the next decade look like from a digital health and pharma standpoint? Like even from the standpoint of from your perspective, having seen all those pharma companies, having seen that kind of transition that they go through or don't go through in some cases.
Yeah.
What's the pharma company of the future look like in 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think one thing I would say is that things definitely move more slowly than everyone expects. So I think AI is going to be huge, but I think it's going to take time. I think one of the things that, like, the major shift for me that's happening for pharma and how they're using technology is that they're creating more intimate relationships with their customers, right? So they used to only call on providers and they would know everything they could about those providers. I think now they're using technology to engage their patients and start to learn more about those patients so that, they really want to own those relationships. And I think at some point in time, they're going to face the challenge of, do they start to move up the value chain in terms of taking on more responsibility and risk for the outcomes of patients, not just for the use of drugs? Because I think the risk that they face is, do they get disintermediated by some of these new, healthcare companies who come in and say, look, we're gonna take over this population of diabetes patients, and we're going to be responsible for their total care, and we'll choose which drugs, devices, providers that they see. And so at some point in time, do pharma companies just become a widget provider? And their drugs will be commodities, and the people who own the kind of total responsibility will pick and choose from which drugs and devices they want. So I think by adopting technology and by building more intimate relationships, pharma companies will put themselves in a position where they may have a right to play, right, in that sort of total chronic condition management space, which I don't necessarily know that they have a right to do today, but they may in the future.
Yeah. And you talk about disintermediation too, as part of that. Is there, I often wonder the impact of disintermediation on the upfront level, right? So as we talk about more data being involved, you get smarter about, who's at risk for this therapy area, to how do I can diagnose this person before they even know that they're right. Like, how much risk for disintermediation sits at the early stage level when I technically don't need to be a pharma company to figure out if you're sick with disease X?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think it's not really clear yet who is going to own that, but you're absolutely right. I mean, as we get EHR data, as we get genetic data, as we get imaging data, you name it, right? As we start to capture all of this data and really build a holistic picture of patients, what's needed to help support them, what their risks are, what the best treatment methodologies are, that there's absolutely going to be some sort of front end to the patient care experience where this knowledge and information is going to sort of direct what type of care they get and when and how, right? So, I don't know what that looks like, but there will be a point in time where you're absolutely right, where that will all happen on the front end versus what happens today in the healthcare system, where people show up and then they get this battery of tests and months later they kind of figure out what's required.
Yeah. It will be an interesting future for sure. So, listen, Ryan, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us today. I really appreciate you and your generosity of the time. Hopefully folks listening can take something from this that they can add to their digital workbench, I urge you to, if you have questions or comments, please reach out to Ryan. I'm sure he's happy to have the conversation with you as well. But I wanted to thank everybody for joining the podcast this month, and we'll look forward to talking to you next month.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.